you're wondering why I have this Kleenex in my nose, I have a bloody nose, and it comes because, well, Saul has changed in many things. There are things he hasn't changed. And when I told him that Miami would crush the Knicks tomorrow, he hauled off and whacked me.
With my left.
There are many parallels between what Saul just talked about, what I'm going to talk about. I really want to talk about a short time frame, roughly 1968 to 1970, and how the events and ideas of that period really brought an end to traditional notions of college education. And to some extent, I'd argue, not a lot has changed since 1970, except for the worst. Last night, I was talking with one of my sons about the idea of small-town conformism, and I said, when I was in college in the 1960s, it was our understanding that we were there in order to be able to overturn what John Dewey called the village truths that produce conformity. And the irony to me, I said, was that all these years later, academia had recreated village conformity in academia on the basis of its own version of village truths, independent of empirical evidence. As I was trying to explain to him what I thought happened, I realized he couldn't make sense of what I was talking about. He's very well read. And he said to me, well, you mean you had professors who were leftists and didn't think the university should be politicized? How can that be? No, really, he wasn't being.
That's true.
He just couldn't comprehend. So I started talking to him about one of my teachers, Gene Genovese, and one of my mentors, Irving Howe. And I told them their positions on this and that and how they fought the politicization of the university. He said, again, this doesn't make sense. You're telling me, he said, that they had Marxist leanings still. They never completely lost their Marxist inclinations. I said, yes, that's right. So he said, how can they then have been opposed to politicizing the university? I said, what's interesting to me, son, is that as I'm talking to you, I realize that the very idea of the anti-communist left, which is once so important in America, is utterly invisible to even well-read young people today. The idea that it could be anti-communist leftists just didn't occur. It didn't occur to him. And I realized as I was talking to him that anti-communism and the closing of the academic mind were really very much the same thing. And that's what I want to talk a little bit about, how that played out. How anti-communism of the New Left was the gateway to political correctness on campus. In 1965, I heard a man named Herbert Marcuse. I know people say I mispronounce it. That's all right. I've been pronouncing it that way since 1965. It's fine. Gave a speech at Rutgers where I was an undergraduate. I was utterly flabbergasted by the speech. It took me years to make sense of it. I thought he was a deranged in some ways, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. In that speech, he argued, it was right out of the famous essay on repressive tolerance, which I didn't realize when I was listening to it. He argued that the idea of tolerance, what Saul was talking about as neutrality, he argues belongs to a liberal, Marcuse argued belonged to a liberal democratic tradition which was exhausted. He argued that liberal society was based, he called it liberalist society, was based on a form of domination so subtle that the majority accepts and even wills their servitude. In such a situation, tolerance, as traditionally understood, serves the cause of domination. And here too is an overlap. The idea that America was subtly fascist was central to the New Left and central to what the curriculum would become. Here's from the essay on repressive tolerance. Free speech for the misguided, for those who assume America was a relatively free society, is objectively reactionary. Going on. The world of the concentration camps was not an exceptionally monstrous society. What we saw there was the image and, in a sense, the quintessence of the infernal society into which we are plunged every day. Now, we got some of this in Betty Friedan, you know, the woman in her kitchen is being caught in a concentration camp. But this appealed to people on a different plane. And he knew it. He knew he was on. And so when he wrote a postscript to Oppressive Tolerance a few years later, he included the following words: "Such extreme suspension of the rights of free speech and free assembly," which is what he was calling for, "is justified only if the whole of society is in extreme danger. I maintain that our society is in just such an emergency situation, and that the emergency has become the normal state of affairs. With the emergency at hand, what was required was counter-indoctrination," his words. The restoration, quote, "the restoration of freedom of thought necessitates a new and rigid restriction on teaching and practices in educational institutions." In other words, those things which were not politically correct needed to be pushed out of the curriculum. He wanted to, quote, "withdraw tolerance from regressive movements before they can become active." In that sense, Marcuse was very successful. Now, I don't want to place a whole burden of this on Marcuse. Marcuse articulated what was evolving, and he interacted with the student radicals, including, I'm sorry to say, myself.
And me.
And that's, yeah, and Saul. He didn't whack Saul. But there was a broader breakdown at hand. And another one of the gurus of the period was Norman O. Brown. I assume is forgotten by everyone under the age of 60. I mean, I mentioned Norman O. Brown. Who is this guy? Just as well. Here's Norman O. Brown. He's famously known for his call for polymorphous perversity. He too was a success. Quote, "We are in bondage to authority outside of ourselves, most obviously in bondage to the authority of books. The bondage to books compels us not to see with our own eyes. It compels us to see with the eyes of the dead, with dead eyes. There is a hex on us, the specter in books, the authority of the past. It exercise those ghosts is a great work of magical self-liberation." Well, those exact words were spoken during the student takeover of the University of Pittsburgh in 1970. It was spoken on behalf of a graduate student who called for burning the library, essentially freeing the graduate students from the burden of what was contained in the books. Now, this is part of a broader breakdown. And the great philosopher Leszek Kolakowski, I see there's a new collection of his essays just been put out by his daughter. Kolakowski's in the United States in 1968, and this is what he sees on campus. "What impressed me was the mental degradation of a kind I'd never seen before in any leftist movement. I saw young people trying to reconstitute the universities and to liberate themselves from the horrifying, savage, monstrous, fascist oppression. The list of demands with variations was very similar on campuses all over the world." I would argue that these tendencies metastasized, but that they assumed coherent structural form in the wake of 1970. What happens in 1970? Earth Day, the largest public demonstrations in the United States before or since. That's in April. In May, the Black Panthers are on trial in New Haven for murdering one of their own, Alex Rackley, also something completely forgotten. And it very nearly came to bloodshed. Very nearly came to bloodshed. Nixon's bombing of Cambodia ensues. We get Kent State, and we get eruptions on campuses all across the country. And what happens on many campuses is the remaining liberals who take the perspective of Genovese and Irving Howe slide over. They begin to accept the students' arguments that the university has to be politicized, that we're in the middle of a fascist takeover. This is before the George Wallace campaign. That only exacerbates it. So on the Amherst College campus, for instance, Leo Marx and George Kateb, two very bright guys, written fine books, go at each other. And Marx eventually wins. He wins Kateb over the notion that university has to become a political organization, a political institution. Here's Leo Marx. How can we go out into the streets and talk to the people who are so prejudiced against us? This strike is a signal that the present policies of the American government, if persisted in, will eventually destroy the structure of higher education in America. Well, that structure was destroyed, but not for those reasons. America, as Marx described it, was a society devoted to war, racism, and imperialism. 1972, when Vietnam was de-escalating and the rioting, for the most part, calmed down, James Q. Wilson, who unfortunately recently passed away, wrote that the list of subjects which cannot be discussed in a free and open forum on campus has grown steadily and now includes the war in Vietnam, the inner city, the relationship between intelligence and heredity, the role of corporations in certain overseas regimes, and he went on. The substantive commitment to supporting the victims of American society overwhelmed the older university commitment to an academic life organized around open debate. I was in graduate school then, so I got to watch this close all around me. I watched people just simply shut off discussion. You couldn't do it anymore. And I realized as time went on, I spent time later at the Institute for Advanced Study arguing with Clifford Geertz. For all his brilliance and marvelous intellectual qualities, he too had pulled the gate down. You simply couldn't discuss certain topics like Indonesian communism. Let me conclude with a summary from a friend of mine who's since become a rabbi and no longer holds the views he held 40 years ago. Sides are being chosen up. There's little to debate. The only question is, Fred, is not what's true, but which side are you on? And I think much of what's happened for the last 40 years is the playing out of that division. Thank you.